Welcome to the Books of Titans podcast, where I seek truth in the world's great books. I'm your host, Eric Rostad, coming to you from the beautiful Books of Titans studio in Franklin, Tennessee. My goal is to read 200 of the great books over the next 10 years and share what I'm learning. I'll talk a bit about each book, tie ideas together from a variety of genres, and share the one thing I always hope to remember from each of the great books. Today I'm going to cover one of Euripides' least familiar tragedies, Children of Heracles. This is from book 34 for my 2024 reading list, and Euripides is selection 15 for my great books reading list. Well, you may know Heracles as Hercules. Hercules is the Latin version of Heracles, which is the Greek version of the name. Same person, and what we know of Heracles, this takes place before we get into this particular play, The Children of Heracles. But what we know of Heracles is that he had these 12 labors that he performed during his life. They were the result of Zeus's jealous wife, Hera, who just had it out for Heracles. And she put this madness into him, and in the midst of that madness, he killed his wife and children with his bow and arrow. And so when Heracles gets out of this madness that Hera has caused him, he sees what he has done. He's killed his wife and children, and he knows that he must atone for this. So to find out how he can do that, how he can atone for that, he goes to the Oracle of Delphi, which tells him that he must serve the king of Mycenae, Eurystheus, for 10 years. During those years, Eurystheus has him complete 12 labors. And then later on, Heracles dies. We find out about all these things in different tragedy plays, many of them by Sophocles. They are excellent. I've covered them in previous episodes, which I'll link to in the show notes. But we learn a lot about Heracles in these tragedy plays. But at the end of his life, we learn that Philoctetes is the one that lights the funeral pyre, and we learn that in Sophocles' tragedy play, Women of Trachis. And as a reward for that, Philoctetes gets the bow and arrow of Heracles. Again, this is the bow and arrow that has killed his wife and children. Later on, Philoctetes is the one who kills Paris, and he kills Paris using that famous bow and arrow. So mythologically speaking, we are in the generation before the Trojan War in this particular tragedy play, Children of Heracles. But historically, we are in 430 BC, which is when Euripides wrote this tragedy play. And that is an important date because that is around the start of the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta. And that's what I'm reading about right now. I'm reading Thucydides, and I'm reading his Peloponnesian War. And the way that this ties into this particular tragedy play is that a lot of what is happening is taking place around Athens, near Athens. It's taking place in the city of Marathon, which is northeast of Athens. And Sparta is in the Peloponnese. It is somewhat close to Argos, which is where Heracles is from, where the children of Heracles have had to flee. And so that is where we find ourselves when we come into this tragedy play here. So before I get into the story, I just want to cover three things that are always good, no matter what tragedy you're reading, just to note these three things as you're starting the tragedy. The first is, who is the chorus? So in this one, the chorus is made up of the old men of Marathon. Second thing to note is, who is the first speaker? In this one, it is Aeolus. And Aeolus is a nephew of Heracles and fought and did some of the labors of Heracles with him. But now he has tasked himself with protecting the children of Heracles. The third thing to note is just where is this? Where is this taking place? And this particular one is taking place in Marathon. So now I want to take the approach in this episode like I did last week, where I just go straight through the tragedy play. And I'll do this rather quickly, but I just want to highlight the main points of the story so you can kind of understand what happens in this play. And then as I'm doing that, I'll cover some themes. I'll cover themes that I've seen in other tragedy plays, and then I'll read some of my favorite passages as well. At the very end, I will cover just a few other notes about this particular tragedy, and then I'll share the one thing that I'm still thinking about after having read Children of Heracles. So let's start by just walking straight through this play. Like I mentioned, we start with Aeolus, who is speaking, and he is at the temple of Zeus in Marathon. He has fled from Argos, and he has with him the children of Heracles, and he also has the mother of Heracles, and her name is Alcmene. And so they are traveling around, and they're just having a horrible time because that king who put Heracles through those labors, Eurystheus, he has it out for the children of Heracles. He thinks that those children are going to seek revenge, and they're going to try to avenge their father by killing Eurystheus for putting Heracles through these awful labors. And so Eurystheus wants to get ahead of the game and kill the children before the children kill him. So the children are going around and with Aeolus, and they're just seeking refuge somewhere. And everywhere they go, Eurystheus is pursuing them. And he'll send a herald, and so the children of Heracles will be in a city, and the herald will come and say, you've got to come back to Argos because we need to kill you. We need to stone you to death. And so they just kind of keep going to new cities to try to escape this Eurystheus. And they finally reached Marathon, and they're at the temple of Zeus. And this is important because Zeus is the protector of the suppliant. He is the protector of the foreigner. He's the protector of the asylum seeker. And that is what the children of Heracles are at this point, and it's what Aeolus, who is kind of protecting them. They're all in this temple of Zeus seeking help. And Marathon is close to Athens, so the person who comes to help is the king of Athens, and his name is Demophon. So that's kind of the main characters we have here. And so the herald of Eurystheus, the king of Mycenae, that herald comes to Marathon, and he arrives to take the children of Heracles back to Argos to have them stoned to death. And Aeolus is the first person to speak to this herald, and he says, and when the herald says you must come back, Aeolus, who's protecting the children, he says, no, I won't. We shall be protected by the god's altar and the freedom of the land we have come to. End quote. So right away we see that there is this difference. There is one side who is trying by force, by brute force, by violence to accomplish a particular deed. On the other hand, you have an appeal to a set of laws, to a land where people are free, and to a land that protects the alien, protects the suppliant, and especially if they're in this temple of Zeus. And so Aeolus says, no way, you're not taking us by force. And then Demophon, the king of Athens, he comes in and he addresses the herald. And they're going back and forth. And the herald asks the king of Athens, who by this point is saying, yes, we are going to protect these children. The herald asks him, is your treatment of suppliants worth war? Because that's what's going to happen here. If Demophon, the king of Athens, if he does not give up these children in Aeolus, then the herald will return with an army and there will be a battle. So that's a pretty important question here. Is this group of a few people, is that important? Is that so important? Is this ideal that you have of treatment of suppliants, is that worth war? And here is how the herald asks this question. As you bury your dead, on whose behalf will you say they fell? Which allies would you have been defending? You'll reap abuse from your fellow citizens if you follow your feet in bilge water for the sake of an old man with one foot in the grave, a virtual nobody, and for these children. End quote. So here the herald is really putting it to Demophon and just saying, is this worth it? And Demophon responds and says this. If I let this altar be robbed by the violent actions of a stranger, people will think that the land I rule is not free. End quote. Again, we get back to this idea of, I like to call it Ares versus Areopagus. And Ares is the god of war, the god of force. The Areopagus, on the other hand, is where Athena establishes law, establishes justice and democracy, but just it establishes deliberation and what is known as the starting point of civilization, where you try to deliberate on a problem as opposed to using force. And deliberation, conversation, these things are the things of civilization. These are the things of freedom, as opposed to things being done by force. So you get a lot of this in this particular play of this back and forth between these two things. So if I let this altar be robbed by the violent actions of a stranger, people will think that the land I rule is not free. I love that because it puts that into view of you lose freedom when force is in play. If somebody is being forced out of the country as a suppliant, then that puts at risk the whole idea of the freedom of that land. Marathon as a city also says no, they're not going to give up these people. And so the herald goes back, and then he returns with the Argive army, and it's led by that king Eurystheus, that the king that put Heracles through all of those labors. So this freaks Demophon out, the king of Athens, and so he consults the oracles and says, "What should I do? What do we need to do here?" And the oracles come back and they say that you must sacrifice a daughter, a maiden born of a noble father. And it goes on and says, Demophon says, "But I shall not kill my own daughter, nor force any of my fellow citizens to do so against his wishes. And who is heartless enough to give up his beloved children willingly?" End quote. So Demophon gets the oracle. It says that a maiden must be sacrificed. And then Demophon, this really puts it into perspective for him. So on the one hand, before we had these ideals of freedom, we had these ideals of taking care of the suppliants. But when it comes down to, am I going to sacrifice my own daughter? Am I going to have to ask one of my people to sacrifice their daughter? And it just really puts it into perspective and shows that element in a literary form here of the sacrifice required for some of these ideals. And so Demophon and the Athenians, and the people of Marathon, they're no way. We're not doing this. We're not going to sacrifice one of our daughters for this. So Aeolus, again, he's the nephew of Heracles who is taking care of the children. He offers himself. It is a very noble thing, but they won't have anything to do with that because he's this old man. But then a daughter of Heracles says that she will offer herself. And we're not given her name. We're just given the name Maiden for this person. But it is a child of Heracles, and she says, I will be that sacrificial victim that the oracle says needs to take place. And that's what happens. You kind of hope in this tragedy that at the last minute she'll get saved out of this, that, actually, we don't need a sacrifice here, but it happens. And it's like in the middle of the tragedy, and this maiden, Heracles' daughter, offers herself. And she says, "By not clinging to life, I've discovered what is finest." This gets into another theme that we see in a lot of the tragedies, and it's just that oftentimes it's the young and the innocent who suffer. The people who are responsible for the actions, responsible for the things that are happening, a lot of times they are not the ones who suffer. And that's just part of this element of the tragedy, that it's oftentimes the innocent, this young maiden who is forced to suffer. She, in this case, does it willingly, but it just kind of gets into this bigger idea that with these ideals, with war, with all these battles, there is innocence that is lost. There's innocence that has to be sacrificed, and it is a tragedy. So let me read on. We get into ideas of fate here. Here's where we kind of take a step back in the tragedy, and the chorus has this section where they sing, and they sing this. No man, in my view, is well off or badly off except by heaven's will, nor does success securely attend one house forever. One fate after another pursues it. Fate settles one man in a humble station, brought down from the heights, and gives the pauper wealth. We are not allowed to evade fate. Wisdom is no defense, and no one who does his best to repel it will always labor in vain. At the end there, and one who does his best to repel it will always labor in vain. I'll end the quote there. But very strong ideas of fate there, and again, another theme that shows up in a lot of these tragedies. So now the herald has returned with the army. Eurystheus is at the head of this army, and the people of Marathon are getting ready to battle. And Aeolus wants to be a part of this. Again, he is protecting the children, but he is very old. And so you have this hilarious back and forth as he's walking with one of his slaves. He's walking to the battle, and Aeolus just wants to fight. And the slave is telling him, well, your spirit may be willing, but your flesh is incapable. And so there's just this quite humorous back and forth in that part. And then Aeolus at the end of this says, that's another thing success wrongly attracts, a reputation for bravery. We imagine that someone who's doing well has every skill there is. I thought that was just a fun little insight into humankind. Well, in this battle, they do conduct the war, and Eurystheus at the head of the Argive army, they attack the Athenians. They attack them at Marathon here. And so a battle ensues. And during this battle, Aeolus, this old man, is rejuvenated. And amidst the battle, he prays to Hebe and Zeus. And for a little backstory here, let me read, and this comes from the very end in the notes to the version that I read. Here's a little backstory on that. So this is while Heracles is in heaven. Heracles' marriage to Hebe had given him everlasting youth and brought about his reconciliation with Hebe's mother Hera, who had dogged him with persistent malevolence throughout his life. End quote. So again, that's a note from the translator. That's not part of the play, but it gets into a part of the mythology where, again, remember at the beginning I said Hera just dogged Heracles his whole life, but once in heaven, Heracles marries Hebe, who is Hera's daughter, and Hera and Heracles make up, and all things are good in that sense. So when Aeolus prays to Hebe and Zeus, Hebe is married to Heracles at this point in heaven, and Hebe hears the prayer of Aeolus, and rejuvenates him. And so like he gets strong again, he gets his muscles back, and he becomes this warrior again. And it's one of the rare times that this happens in tragedy where someone changes like that. And so it's a really interesting thing to see in this particular play. So the battle concludes, and as part of this, in the battle, this rejuvenated Aeolus, he captures Eurystheus. He captures the man who had put Heracles through all of those labors. And there's this back and forth of what should we do with Eurystheus. And the Athenians are saying, it is against our law to kill him. But the mother of Heracles, Alcmene, says we need to kill him. And so at the end of the play, we see Eurystheus being led off to death. And that just hits on this brutality of war, but it also hits on necessities of war, brutalities of war, in the sense of there's these ideals that we've been talking about this whole time in this play. This ideal of the suppliant being protected, and law being over force. And yet at the very end here, the Athenians go against their own law and kill Eurystheus. So there's so much to think about in this play, so many different themes that are happening. But it's a brilliant tragedy in that sense of seeing the Athenians have these ideals, have these laws, but how even during the brutality of war, sometimes those just go right out the window. This play is known as being incomplete, and they think there are missing pieces at the very end of this tragedy. So it does end abruptly, and that might be partly because we are missing pieces of it. What's also interesting about this particular tragedy is that if you look at the other tragedies of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, they most often carry the title of the main character. So whoever the main character is in these tragedies, that's what the title of the tragedy is. Or sometimes they'll also carry the name of the chorus, as in the women of Trachis, or they will carry the main event that happens in that tragedy. But this one is different in that we don't even get the names of the children. We get the names of a few of them, but they're for the most part they're nameless. They're just the children of Heracles, and we don't know them by name. So it's just very interesting that the title of this particular tragedy, it kind of goes against the norm of titling these tragedy plays. There were a number of other more memorable characters, whether that was Eurystheus, Aeolus, or Alcmene, that could have had the title of this particular tragedy. This is one of 19 surviving plays by Euripides. He wrote over 90 in his life. The version I read is the Oxford World's Classics, and this contains Alcestis, Heracles, Children of Heracles, and Cyclops. The translation was by Robin Waterfield. In thinking back on this tragedy and thinking about the one thing I'm still thinking about after this, it would have to be this, that the Spartans traced their descent from Heracles. So at the beginning, I mentioned that this was written in 430. This is written at a time for an Athenian audience, but it's written at a time where Athens and Sparta are starting to battle each other in this, what will become a 27-year Peloponnesian War. And so just to consider that Heracles, the children of Heracles can also be thought of as Spartans in a way, since Spartans trace their descent from Heracles. So what does it mean to have the unnamed children pleading for mercy? What does it mean to have this maiden sacrifice in this, knowing that these are the children of Heracles, that these are where the Spartans trace their descent? It just adds this kind of whole other element to this particular tragedy play. Well, to recap, these tragedies are such good fun. I mean, they are difficult topics. They're tragedies. They're damned if you do, they're damned if you don't. They are impossible situations that people are put into. It makes you put yourself in their shoes. What would you do in this circumstance? How would you handle these things? They're brilliant. I love these tragedies so much. I'm about halfway through my reading of the tragedies by Euripides. I'm reading all 19, so I've read about half of those so far, and probably be 2025 when I finish reading those. But if you have never read the tragedies, please start. They are so good. If you really want to get into them, I would strongly suggest reading Homer before you get into the tragedies. So start with the Iliad and then go into the Odyssey. This will obviously take a long time, but it will be so worth it. And reading Homer first will help you to understand the tragedies and just have a better grasp of Greek mythology going into these tragedies, and also just know a lot of the stories that the tragedies are based off, or in this case, kind of get a story before the Trojan War and before Odysseus and all that. So that's great fun as well. I am on Substack now, and that's where this podcast is hosted. And I also did that just to offer you guys options for supporting this podcast. So if you get value out of this podcast, I'd love if you could return the value. Just had a couple new people sign up in the last week. So there are now 14 people who are giving to this podcast. And I'm so thankful for you guys. It helps to fund the work that I'm doing. So I have options for $5 a month, $99 a year, or $500 per year. As I mentioned before, I'm currently reading the Peloponnesian War by Thucydides. I'm doing that as part of a Catherine Project reading group. If you're unfamiliar with them, they offer free online reading groups where you go through a ton of different classics. So you just sign up for a particular classic or set of classics, and then over like a 2 or 3 month period, you'll go through these with a group of people from all over the world. So it's exciting, it's fun. So we're starting with the Peloponnesian War by Thucydides, and then getting into Xenophon and Hellenica, and so that'll be coming up next. And that's how I'm going to kind of close out this year of reading. Each year I spend 8 months reading the great books. I spend the first 2 months reading straight through a different version of the Bible. March through June is the great books. July, I take a break and just read stuff on my to be read list. So it's more modern books, that kind of thing. Back to the great books in August through November. And then December, I take another break month where I just read for my to be read pile. So probably just the Thucydides and Xenophon to close out this year. And then in December, I will get back into that to be read pile. That is going to do it for this episode. Thank you for listening. I would love to hear from you. Best thing you can do if you want to start kind of a discussion around Children of Heracles is to just comment on Substack, comment on this podcast episode post, and that can start a nice discussion there. If you would like to contact me directly, you can email me at eric@booksoftitans.com. You can also follow Books of Titans on Instagram or Twitter, just at Books of Titans. And I have a website. So I've got the Substack, which is booksoftitans.com. I also have a website where I list all of my reading lists, reviews, my details about the books and that kind of thing. That's at books.booksoftitans.com. So check that out as well. I've got my full great books reading list that I'm planning to go through over the next 15 years, and just all reading lists all the way back to 2017. So I will be back in a week or two with another episode. And until then, keep reading, keep learning, and keep listening. I'm out.